Imagine stepping into a world where judgment is instant, where the color of your skin, the way you carry yourself, or simply existing in a space others believe isn't meant for you, makes you a target. Naomi Sinclair knows this feeling all too well. A brilliant and accomplished black woman, she has spent her life proving herself in rooms where people like her were never expected to succeed. But today isn't about boardrooms, courtrooms, or places where titles matter. Today, she is just another passenger on a first-class flight. And to one flight attendant, that means she's just another easy target. On the surface, Diane Mercer is the epitome of professionalism. A seasoned flight attendant who prides herself on delivering top-tier service to the right kind of passengers. But when she spots Naomi, a pregnant black woman, elegantly dressed, yet carrying none of the arrogance of old money, something inside her twists. She sees an imposter. And that's when she makes the biggest mistake of her life. This isn't just a story about a bad flight. This is a collision of privilege, power, and justice. It's a story that will make you angry, frustrated, and ultimately deeply satisfied. Because what happens when the person you've spent hours humiliating turns out to be the most powerful person on the plane? Hit like if you believe karma always wins. Subscribe now so you never miss a powerful story like this. Have you ever witnessed unfair treatment like this? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Naomi Sinclair stepped into the first-class cabin of Astra Airways, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her leather handbag. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt it, the silent but heavy weight of judgment pressing down on her. She had flown first class before, but today felt different. There was something unspoken in the air, a tension that slithered through the cabin the second her presence was noticed. Near the entrance, Diane Mercer stood with perfect posture, her crisp uniform unwrinkled, her expression unreadable, at least to the untrained eye. But Naomi knew that look. Diane's icy blue eyes swept over her in a slow, deliberate scan, like a security sensor searching for flaws. Then, just as slowly, her lips curled into a half-smirk. A quiet, dismissive chuckle escaped her lips. "First class is really letting just anyone in these days," she muttered, just loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. Naomi stiffened but kept her face neutral. She had spent too many years walking into unwelcoming spaces to let a passive-aggressive remark from a flight attendant rattle her. With quiet confidence, she extended her boarding pass. "Naomi Sinclair, seat 2A. Diane took the ticket, barely glancing at it before sighing, heavily, as if Naomi had personally inconvenienced her. She rolled her eyes and turned slightly toward Emily Carter, another flight attendant, and murmured under her breath, "Another last-minute upgrade, I suppose." The condescending lilt in her voice made it clear she didn't think Naomi belonged here. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" Her tone was calm but firm. Diane turned back with an exaggeratedly sweet smile. "Oh, nothing, dear," she said, flipping Naomi's ticket back into her hand with a flick of her wrist. "Enjoy your flight." The words dripped with insincerity. Naomi didn't respond. She simply lifted her chin slightly, adjusted the strap of her bag, and walked past Diane without another glance. But she felt the woman's eyes burning into her back. As she moved to her seat, she took note of how other passengers were treated. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit received a warm greeting, along with an offer of champagne. A woman in designer sunglasses was ushered to her seat with a polite compliment on her handbag. Naomi barely concealed hostility. She settled into seat 2A, exhaling slowly, willing herself to let it go. She had dealt with worse, but Diane wasn't finished. As Naomi placed her handbag beside her seat, Diane suddenly appeared at her side again, her expression tinged with thinly veiled irritation. "I'll need to store that for you," she said, reaching for Naomi's bag. Naomi looked up. "It fits under my seat." Diane gave her a tight, patronizing smile. "I'm sure it does, but we have policies about keeping the cabin neat. We wouldn't want anything cluttering the space, would we?" Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Naomi's handbag and walked off with it. Naomi inhaled sharply, but didn't protest. She simply folded her hands in her lap, pressing her fingers together in restraint. From across the aisle, a woman dressed in a sleek navy business suit shot Naomi a brief glance, something between sympathy and silent acknowledgement. Naomi returned the look before shifting her focus back to the window. In the galley, Diane smirked as she shoved the bag into an overhead compartment. She leaned toward Emily, speaking in a hushed voice. 40-something, pregnant, and trying to play the part, she scoffed. I mean, really? At that age? Emily hesitated before responding. She has a valid ticket, Diane. Diane rolled her eyes. That's not the point, she muttered. People like her are always trying to prove something. Back in her seat, Naomi remained silent. She didn't need to hear Diane's words to know exactly what she was saying. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight's imminent departure. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, making final checks. Then, one final stop. Diane made a beeline for Naomi's row. She leaned down, her voice syrupy sweet. First time flying first class, dear? Let me know if you need help understanding how things work. Naomi met her gaze steadily. I know exactly how things work. For the first time, Diane's smile faltered. But it was brief. She straightened, turned on her heel, and walked away, her sharp footsteps tapping against the floor. Naomi sat still in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. The flight took off smoothly, the hum of the engines filling the cabin. She wasn't sure if it was the air conditioning or the residual tension from her encounter with Diane, but a distinct chill crept up her spine. The unsettling tension from her earlier exchange with Diane lingered, creeping up Naomi's spine like a slow-moving chill. She exhaled, trying to shake it off, but the tight knot in her stomach refused to unravel. Deciding she needed a small distraction, she pressed the call button. Within moments, Diane appeared. Her expression was unreadable, but Naomi noticed how the woman's posture stiffened ever so slightly, like she was already annoyed. Yes. Diane's tone was clipped, stripped of the warmth she had effortlessly offered to the other passengers. Naomi kept her voice neutral. Could I have some water, please? Diane let out a slow breath through her nose, tilting her head slightly. Water? She repeated, as though Naomi had asked for something absurd. Naomi frowned slightly but nodded. Yes. Diane folded her arms, her lips curving into a smirk. Are you sure? No champagne? No white wine? She asked, the mockery in her voice unmistakable. Oh, right. Maybe that's a bit out of your price range. A few passengers turned their heads. Some pretended not to listen. Others seemed to enjoy the moment, their smirks small but telling. Naomi stiffened but said nothing. Diane sighed dramatically, then disappeared toward the galley. When she returned, she slammed a plastic cup of water onto Naomi's tray table. A few droplets splashed over the edge, darkening the fabric of Naomi's sleeve. There you go. She turned on her heel, already walking away before Naomi could respond. Naomi exhaled slowly, reached for a napkin, and dabbed at the spilled water. She knew exactly what was happening. Diane was testing her, pushing her, seeing how far she could go before Naomi snapped. But Naomi wouldn't give her the satisfaction. A blast of cold air from the overhead vent made her shiver. She hesitated, then pressed the call button again. This time, Diane took longer to return. When she finally did, she planted one hand on her hip and raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Something else? Naomi hesitated before speaking. Could I have a blanket? Diane scoffed, shaking her head slightly as if Naomi had just asked for a 5-course meal. A blanket? It's not that cold in here, she muttered. But she turned toward the storage compartment anyway. When she returned, she didn't hand Naomi a neatly folded plush first-class blanket like the ones wrapped around the other passengers. Instead, she tossed a thin, worn-out blanket onto Naomi's lap. There you go, sweetheart, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Naomi's fingers curled around the fabric. It was rough, frayed at the edges, nothing like the luxurious coverings draped over the other first-class passengers. She glanced around. Others were warm, comfortable, relaxed, sipping their drinks, wrapped in their thick, cozy blankets. But for Naomi, comfort wasn't an option. Diane leaned down, her voice barely above a whisper. All cuddled up now? She smiled, sharp and smug. Careful at your age, wouldn't want to catch a chill. I hear it's harder to recover when you're older. Naomi's jaw tightened. She wasn't naive, she knew exactly what Diane was implying. As if on cue, Emily Carter, the younger flight attendant, walked past. In her hands was a first-class blanket, which she carefully placed over a man just 2 rows ahead. A deliberate move. A message. Naomi exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She wouldn't argue, wouldn't fight. She was trapped here for 4 more hours, and Diane was enjoying every second of it. Diane stepped back, tilting her head in mock consideration. "Or maybe I should bring you some tea," she mused. "Something herbal, nice and gentle for someone in your condition." Naomi inhaled deeply, pressing her fingers into her lap to keep herself still. Diane's smile widened. "That's what I thought," she murmured before turning away. Naomi adjusted the thin blanket over her lap. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, from the weight of humiliation. The plane soared forward, but for Naomi, time froze in place. She clenched her jaw, staring out the window, pretending she was anywhere but here. The slow burn of humiliation sat heavy in her chest. Minutes passed before she exhaled sharply. She needed a break, even if it was just for a moment. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she adjusted her coat and stood. The restroom was only a few rows away. A brief escape. As she walked down the aisle, she felt eyes flick toward her. Some indifferent, some curious, some mildly amused. She kept her gaze forward, ignoring the faint murmurs. She reached for the bathroom door handle, but a shadow loomed behind her. Diane. The flight attendant stepped in front of her, blocking the door with one hand. She smiled, sickly sweet. "Going somewhere?" Naomi froze for a second before composing herself. "Yes," she said evenly. "I need to use the restroom." Diane's gaze flickered downward to Naomi's stomach. Then she smirked. "Hope you're not planning on giving birth in there. We don't exactly offer free delivery services at 30,000 feet. A couple of passengers turned their heads. Someone let out a stifled chuckle. Naomi's fingers curled into her palms. "I won't take long." Her voice remained calm. Diane didn't move. She let the moment stretch, too long, before sighing and stepping aside with an exaggerated gesture. "By all means, take your time. Just don't make a mess." Naomi didn't respond. She pushed the door open, stepped inside, and locked it. Hands flat against the sink, breathing slow. She stared at her reflection. Heat rose in her face. She forced herself to let it fade. A minute passed. She straightened, fixed her coat, and prepared to step out. But when she did, Diane was still there. The smirk had returned. She leaned in, lowered her voice. "You know, I've seen it before." Naomi's pulse picked up. Women who suddenly decide to have a miracle baby when they think it'll secure them a better life. Naomi's breath caught. Diane's smile sharpened. "Late pregnancies are always interesting." She tilted her head slightly. "Makes you wonder if it's about love or something else." Naomi's hands tightened at her sides, but she wouldn't break. Not yet. Diane's shoulder brushed against Naomi's. Just enough to be intentional. Naomi stood motionless. The sting of those words, the sharpness of that touch, it settled deep in her chest like a weight. As she made her way back to her seat, she felt everything pressing down on her. Her age, her pregnancy, her silence. She sank into her chair, her fingers instinctively pressing against her stomach. Outside the window, the world stretched into an endless sky. Inside the cabin, voices blended into a soft hum. The murmur of casual conversation, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of fabric as passengers adjusted their seats. And then the scent, rich, warm, mouth-watering. The aroma of freshly prepared meals filled the air as flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, placing elegantly arranged trays in front of each first-class passenger. Naomi watched as lids were lifted, revealing succulent cuts of steak, glazed salmon, buttery mashed potatoes, perfectly steamed vegetables. It was the kind of meal designed to remind people of the luxury they had paid for. Minutes passed, but Naomi's tray table remained empty. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture poised, her breathing measured. 10 minutes. Still nothing. She glanced toward the galley, where Diane and Emily stood exchanging quiet words before continuing their rounds. Naomi's fingers twitched slightly, but she forced them to remain still. Maybe it was just an oversight. Maybe I was imagining it. Another 10 minutes. Her stomach twisted, not just from hunger, but from the growing realization that this was deliberate. The murmurs of satisfied passengers surrounded her. Utensils clinking against plates, wine glasses being set down on armrests. A woman across the aisle lifting a fork full of pasta, closing her eyes as she savored the bite. Naomi glanced down at her empty tray table, her fingers curled slightly. At the 30-minute mark, she pressed the service button. The response wasn't immediate, but eventually Diane appeared. She folded her arms, standing just close enough to loom over Naomi's seated position. "Something wrong?" she asked, voice deceptively polite. Naomi met her gaze, her tone steady. "I haven't received my meal." Diane blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh, I thought you didn't order one." The lie was so blatant, so effortlessly delivered, that Naomi almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Instead, she inhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. "I did." Diane tapped a manicured nail against her forearm, pretending to think. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she shrugged. "Well, we do have some dietary restrictions noted. Are you sure you can handle what's on the menu?" Naomi frowned. "I don't have dietary restrictions." Diane tilted her head slightly, lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, I just assumed." She turned toward Emily, who had been lingering near the galley, clearly uncomfortable. "Get her plate, would you?" Emily hesitated for just a moment, before quickly retrieving a meal and placing it in front of Naomi with an apologetic glance. Naomi didn't acknowledge her. Diane didn't move away. She lingered, just long enough to make it clear that this wasn't over. As Naomi reached for her utensils, Diane leaned down. Her voice dropped to a low murmur, just for Naomi's ears. "Hope you enjoy this," she whispered. "Not exactly what you're used to, I'm sure, but maybe it'll be a nice change from whatever you usually eat." Naomi's fingers tightened around the fork, but she didn't react. She kept her breathing even, her face unreadable. Diane waited, expecting pushback. When none came, her smile faltered, just a little. Then she straightened, smoothing her uniform. "Well," she said after a beat, "bon appétit." And with that, she walked away. Her satisfaction was evident in the way she carried herself. Naomi stared at the plate before her. The food looked perfect, exquisite even. But she no longer had an appetite for it. She picked up a piece of asparagus with the edge of her fork, watching as the butter glistened under the soft cabin lighting. Around her, passengers continued to eat, drink, and laugh, oblivious, uninterested, complacent. She took a single bite, chewed mechanically, tasted nothing. Her throat felt tight, her body rigid with restraint. She had expected discomfort. She had expected microaggressions, a cold shoulder, a forced smile. But this was something else. Diane wasn't just dismissive. She was enjoying it, testing her, pushing the boundaries to see just how much she could get away with. Naomi set her fork down, slowly, methodically. She wiped her hands on the napkin, evenly, precisely. But she could still feel Diane's words. They clung to her skin like oil, seeping into the quiet spaces of her mind where old wounds resided. She had heard words like these before, spoken in hushed tones in the halls of academia, muttered in boardrooms where she was expected to prove, again and again, that she belonged, whispered in restaurants where assumptions about her worth were made before she even sat down. The plane hummed steadily, its trajectory unwavering. Naomi, however, felt like she was sinking. She folded her hands over her stomach, pressing gently, grounding herself. Then, without a word, she picked up her fork again, and she forced herself to eat. The words Diane had whispered still clung to her skin, but she refused to let the woman see her falter. The steady hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, but the tension was undeniable. A few seats away, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, who had been watching the exchange from the beginning, finally exhaled sharply. He set down his fork and turned in his seat, his gaze flickering between Naomi and Diane, who lingered near the galley, her arms crossed, a smug smirk still playing on her lips. "Excuse me." His voice was firm but controlled. "Is there a reason why this passenger has been treated differently from the rest of us?" The soft murmur of the cabin hushed slightly. A few heads turned. Curiosity piqued. Diane didn't flinch. Instead, she let out an exaggerated gasp, placing a hand over her chest in mock surprise. "Oh my," she drawled, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. "A hero emerges. How dramatic." She cast a slow, pointed glance at Naomi, then turned back to the man. "And what exactly do you think I've done?" The man's jaw tightened. "You've deliberately ignored her, withheld service, and made inappropriate comments." Diane cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Comments?" She turned slightly, spreading her arms as if addressing the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, apparently I'm on trial for speaking." A few passengers chuckled uncomfortably. She turned back to the man, leaning in slightly. "Tell me, sir, do you always insert yourself into situations that have nothing to do with you, or is this a special occasion?" Naomi clenched her jaw. The man, unfazed, met Diane's gaze evenly. "Basic decency is everyone's business." Diane smirked. How noble. She clapped her hands together slowly, the sound sharp in the tense silence. Should we give him a medal? She turned to Emily, who stood frozen near the galley, clearly uncomfortable. Go ahead, find something shiny for our dear gentleman here. Maybe a napkin ring. That should do. A few scattered laughs rippled through the cabin. The man exhaled through his nose, clearly realizing that arguing further would be pointless. He muttered something under his breath and turned back to his meal. Naomi swallowed against the bitterness rising in her throat. She hadn't asked to be defended. She hadn't expected it, but watching Diane twist the moment, turning herself into the victim, only solidified a harsh truth. This wasn't about fairness. This wasn't about right or wrong. This was about power. Naomi just needed to make it through this flight. She adjusted the thin blanket around her lap and reached down to retrieve her handbag from beneath the seat. She moved slowly, carefully, not wanting to draw any more attention to herself. But as she lifted the bag, she felt a sudden, sharp shove against her shoulder. Her balance wavered. The angle was awkward. The unexpected force tilted her forward, her body lurching with the movement of the plane. For a terrifying second, her stomach twisted with nausea and discomfort. She barely caught herself, gripping the armrest to steady her body. A cold, sharp laugh cut through the space. "Oh dear," Diane drawled, voice mocking and syrupy sweet. "You should be more careful. We wouldn't want any accidents, would we?" Naomi turned slowly. Her breath was measured, but her pulse hammered in her ears. She straightened herself, gripping her handbag tightly. Then, for the first time, she met Diane's gaze head-on. "Do you have a problem with me?" Her voice was quiet, steady, each word precise. Diane's lips twitched. "Problem?" She let the word hang in the air, as if she were tasting it. Then, after a long pause, "Not at all." She tilted her head slightly. "I just think certain people should understand their place." A sharp silence followed. The tension thickened, heavy as a storm cloud before a downpour. Naomi exhaled slowly. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Then, without warning, Diane's expression shifted. Just a flicker. Just enough for Naomi to realize something was coming. Too late, the slap landed fast and hard. A sharp, stinging impact across Naomi's cheek. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps. A wine glass clinked against a tray. Silverware paused midair. The world seemed to hold its breath. Naomi's head snapped slightly to the side. Her skin burned where Diane's palm had connected. Her eyes widened, not in shock, in something colder, something quieter. Diane stepped back slightly, her breathing steady, her lips pressing into something between satisfaction and defiance. "Now," she murmured, just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "You have a problem." Naomi sat motionless. Her cheek still stung, but she refused to react. She kept her breathing slow, her fingers rested lightly on the armrest. Her expression unreadable. Diane, however, wasn't done. With exaggerated care, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a napkin, and delicately wiped her hand, as if Naomi had left filth on her skin. She muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Your skin is quite oily." Her tone dripped with condescension. Naomi didn't flinch. Diane let out a small smirk before strolling away, her heels clicking against the floor. Minutes passed. Naomi exhaled slowly, trying to ease the tension in her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment. Exhaustion crept into her limbs. Suddenly, a sharp swish, followed by a burst of harsh sunlight, directly into her face. Naomi's eyes flew open, squinting against the sudden brightness. Diane stood beside her. She had just yanked open the window shade. She tilted her head, feigning surprise. "Oh no, was that too bright? I forgot you were sitting there." A beat passed. Then a sickly sweet smile. "Would you like me to close it?" Naomi blinked, her vision still adjusting. Before she could respond, Diane shrugged. "No? Okay then." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Naomi sat motionless. The sunlight burned against her skin. The juice cup tilted just slightly, just enough for the liquid to slosh over the rim and spill onto Naomi's blouse. A collective gasp rippled through nearby passengers. Diane pressed a hand to her mouth in mock horror. "Oh no," she gasped, her voice dripping with insincerity. Then, tilting her head, eyes glinting, "But, well, I suppose you're used to a little mess, aren't you?" Naomi's hands tightened into fists under the table. But she did not react. Diane leaned in slightly. "Would you like me to fetch you a napkin?" Her smirk widened. "Or perhaps," a dramatic pause, "a nice little apron?" Something more appropriate? A few snickers broke out from behind her. Naomi's jaw clenched, but still, she stayed silent. She picked up a thin, cheap napkin from the meal tray and began dabbing at her shirt. The stain had already set. Diane watched her for a moment before exhaling in mock disappointment. Oh well. Accidents happen. With a casual flick of her wrist, she tossed an unused napkin onto Naomi's lap and sauntered away. Naomi's fingers trembled slightly as she wiped at her blouse. She wasn't angry at the stain. She wasn't even angry at the insult. It was the sheer audacity. The constant, relentless attempts to break her down. The meal sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy, unappetizing. But she had forced herself to eat it, knowing she needed the energy. Her limbs were growing stiff. Her circulation slowed from sitting in one position for too long. A short walk to the restroom would help. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt, pushed herself up, and stepped into the aisle. She barely made it 2 steps before a figure blocked her path. Diane, arms crossed, lips pursed. Going somewhere? Her head tilted slightly, as if genuinely curious. Naomi met her gaze steadily. Restroom. Diane let out a small, amused hum, glancing toward the first-class lavatory at the front of the cabin. Oh, I see. Her smile widened. It's just, well, these facilities are really for our first-class passengers. Her eyes flickered downward, scanning Naomi in a way that made her skin crawl. Are you sure you're in the right place? Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The silence stretched heavy between them. Finally, Diane let out an exaggerated sigh and stepped aside, just slightly, but not enough to fully clear the way. You know, she added, motioning vaguely toward the back of the plane, we do have another restroom. Might be a better fit. Naomi exhaled slowly, unclenching her fists. Then, without another word, she turned around and walked back to her seat. She had expected it. It was just another move in Diane's twisted game. She settled back into her chair, fastening her seatbelt, ignoring the burning sensation of humiliation spreading through her chest. Minutes passed, stretched into what felt like an eternity. The steady hum of the aircraft, the soft murmur of conversation. It all became distant background noise. Her head felt heavy. Her body craved rest. Her mind was clouded with exhaustion. She leaned back, adjusting herself for a more comfortable position, and pressed the button to slightly recline her seat. The moment she did, Diane appeared out of nowhere. With perfectly timed precision, she reached out and pressed the button to bring Naomi's seat upright again. Oh no, Diane gasped in fake concern, placing a hand on her chest. I must have bumped into it. Then her voice dropped, just enough for only Naomi to hear. But honestly, this position is probably better for you. She leaned in slightly. At your age, you don't want to risk back pain, do you? These seats can be so unforgiving, on older spines. A few passengers glanced toward them. Some frowned slightly at the comment. But still, no one spoke up. Naomi forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her face impassive. Her entire body felt like it was fighting against itself, torn between the need to endure and the desire to snap. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. She stayed exactly as she was, refusing to give Diane the satisfaction of a reaction. Diane, sensing yet another victory, gave a small, satisfied nod before continuing down the aisle. Naomi blinked slowly. Her vision swam for a brief second as fatigue weighed her down. She just needed to close her eyes. Just for a moment. Let her mind reset. The moment she did, a sharp snap rang in her ear. Her eyes flew open, heart pounding in her chest. Diane stood beside her, grinning. Oops, she said, flexing her fingers, the same fingers that had just snapped inches from Naomi's face. Didn't mean to startle you. Thought you might have dozed off there. Her eyes glinted with something dark. You wouldn't want that, would you? It'd be a shame if you missed anything important. Naomi forced herself to sit completely still, ignoring the heat creeping up her neck. Though, I guess at your stage, Diane sighed dramatically, tapping a manicured nail against the edge of Naomi's tray table. Exhaustion must be normal. She paused. Then in a mocking tone, I just hope it's not a sign of anything, you know? She let the words hang in the air, then flashed a sickeningly sweet smile. Would be awful if this flight became too much for you. The humiliation, the calculated cruelty, the relentless degradation. She had endured all of it, without a single word of protest. She had let Diane revel in her power, let her bask in the control she thought she had. But Naomi knew something Diane didn't. Real power didn't come from petty authority. Real power came from patience, from waiting for the right moment. And that moment had just arrived. It started with a voice, small, innocent, but piercing in its clarity. "Mom, why is that lady being so mean?" The words sliced through the uneasy silence, unfiltered, unburdened by the weight of social politeness. A few passengers turned their heads instinctively. Eyes flickered toward the source of the voice. A young boy, no older than 12, sitting across the aisle, his wide eyes fixed on Naomi and Diane. A moment of stunned silence. Then, "Mom, why is that lady being so mean?" The words hung in the air, cutting through the uneasy quiet like a knife. A few heads turned instinctively, eyes flickering toward the source. A young boy, no older than 12, sat across the aisle, his wide gaze fixed on Naomi and Diane. His mother stiffened beside him, her fingers gripping the armrest as if willing him to stop speaking. But the boy wasn't finished. "She keeps picking on her," he continued, his voice carrying through the cabin with an unintentional authority. "Isn't she supposed to be a good person?" Then, with childlike innocence, he frowned. "I saw her on TV before, didn't I?" His mother's face paled. "That's enough," she whispered hurriedly, reaching for his arm. But it was too late. The shift was subtle at first. A few passengers turned toward Naomi, their expressions shifting, eyes narrowing in recognition. A man a few rows away furrowed his brow, staring at her as though trying to place a face he had seen before. His hand moved to his pocket. He pulled out his phone, typed something quickly. His fingers moved with increasing urgency. Then, he stopped. His breath hitched. His gaze snapped back to Naomi. Disbelief flashed across his face before giving way to something else. Horror. "Wait a second," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for those around him to hear. He turned his phone toward the light, scrolling rapidly through a web page. His expression grew more and more alarmed. Then, suddenly, his voice cut through the cabin, louder this time. "Oh my God!" He looked around wildly, eyes darting between Naomi and his screen. Then, his gaze locked onto Diane. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing this entire flight?" The tension snapped like a taut wire. More passengers turned. Curiosity shifted into whispers of speculation. For the first time, Diane's expression wavered. But she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes with exaggerated irritation. "Oh, what now?" she scoffed. The man ignored her. His attention was solely on Naomi. He double-checked his phone one last time, as if ensuring he wasn't mistaken. Then his head lifted. His voice was now a mask of incredulity. "That's Naomi Sinclair." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances. Some gasped. Others stared at Naomi as realization settled in. The man inhaled sharply. "She's the wife of Victor Sinclair, the chairman of Astra Airways." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then, like a spark meeting gasoline, it spread. Passengers scrambled for their phones. Fingers moved quickly across screens. "A woman 2 rows back," let out an audible gasp, clasping her hands over her mouth. Another man whispered something under his breath, his face paling as he stared at his phone. The realization rippled through the cabin, turning quiet amusement into palpable horror. Diane blinked. For the first time, a flicker of doubt passed through her expression. "That's ridiculous," she scoffed. But her confidence faltered. The man turned his phone toward her. The screen glowed with an article. A photograph of Naomi at a formal gala, standing beside her husband. The headline read, "Naomi Sinclair, the woman behind Astra Airways' global expansion." The image was unmistakable. More whispers, more movement. Someone let out a stunned curse. A woman in the back muttered, "She's not just his wife, she's on the executive board." A cold shudder passed through Diane's spine. The power she thought she had, the control she had wielded so effortlessly, was crumbling in real time. She felt it slipping from her grasp, unraveling thread by thread. The amused glances she had exchanged with passengers earlier were gone. Instead, eyes were on her now, watching, judging, condemning. A man who had been silent the entire flight finally turned toward Diane. His voice was low, firm, unforgiving. "You've spent this entire flight humiliating the most powerful woman on this airline." His head tilted slightly. "Do you have any idea what's about to happen to you?" Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot. The whispers spread like wildfire. The power she had once held, gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Emily, the younger flight attendant, hesitated. Then, without a word, she bolted toward the cockpit. Disappearing behind the curtain, the intercom crackled to life. Diane Mercer, report to the cockpit immediately. Heads turned. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. The energy in the cabin shifted, from hushed murmurs to electrified anticipation. Then the curtain parted, and Captain Harris stepped into the cabin. His presence alone was enough to command attention, but it was the cold steel in his gaze that sent a shiver down Diane's spine. "Miss Mercer," he said, voice clipped. "Follow me, now." His tone left no room for argument. Diane forced a stiff laugh, grasping at the last threads of authority she thought she had. "Captain, what's going on? I'm in the middle of my duties." "You have no duties anymore." Captain Harris cut her off. His voice was final. "You spent this flight mistreating and physically assaulting the wife of the Astra Airways chairman. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately." A sharp intake of breath echoed from multiple passengers. The words hit Diane like a slap. Her body locked in place, as if the plane itself had tilted beneath her feet. Someone pulled out their phone, recording. Her world was collapsing. Her lips parted, but no words came. She could feel eyes burning into her from every direction. The same passengers who had laughed with her before now watched with morbid curiosity. "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice unsteady, her bravado crumbling. Captain Harris's expression didn't change. "That's not an excuse." He nodded toward the approaching security personnel. "When we land, corporate security will be waiting for you. I suggest you prepare yourself." A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence. Then another. Passengers exchanged glances. Then, one by one, they joined in. The applause swelled, no longer amused, but triumphant. "Miss Mercer, please come with us." The voice was flat, almost bored. Passengers shifted their legs aside as Diane was escorted down the aisle. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her like an unbearable force. Some passengers whispered, others scoffed, but no one stopped her fate from unfolding. A chuckle, low, mocking, broke through the murmurs. "Enjoy unemployment." Diane's feet faltered for just a second. As she passed Naomi's row, she hesitated. Naomi had not moved, had not spoken. Her face remained calm, unreadable, utterly composed. She had done nothing, she had needed to do nothing, and somehow, that made it so much worse. Diane swallowed hard. Then she walked on, her footsteps heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of everything. She stepped off the plane in complete silence. Flanked by 2 security personnel, she felt the shame clinging to her like a heavy coat, suffocating with every step. Then, she saw them. A group of Astra Airways executives waiting at the gate. Their faces were void of sympathy, no greetings, no chance to explain. Just a thick stack of termination papers placed firmly in front of her. A cold voice spoke. "You are suspended effective immediately. An official investigation will follow." Then, the final blow. "But let me be clear. You will never work for Astra Airways again." The words hit harder than the slap she had given Naomi. Her hands trembled as she picked up the pen. She signed the papers, her vision blurring as the finality of her fate set in. Her gaze darted around, searching for even a flicker of support. Anything. But all she saw were disgusted stares. All she heard were whispers. Because it had already happened. The story had gone viral. Millions had seen the footage, had heard the venom in her voice, had watched her face twist in arrogance as she belittled the wrong person. And now, the whole world knew. Diane sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her inbox. Every email, a rejection. Some airlines never responded. Others sent curt, one-sentence refusals. She was blacklisted. No one wanted the liability of hiring the disgraced flight attendant who had made global headlines for all the wrong reasons. Her savings dwindled fast. Rent loomed over her. Friends, once eager to share drinks with her in first-class lounges, stopped returning her calls. She wasn't just unemployed, she was untouchable. With no other options, she took a job at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The cafe buzzed with chatter. The hum of conversations filled the air. Diane, now dressed in a simple uniform and an old apron, wiped the counters. Her hands ached from hours of scrubbing. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact. Some customers had started recognizing her over the past few weeks. They never said much, just exchanged quiet smirks or knowing glances. Their expressions said everything. She had become a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a lesson in power abused and lost. Then, a voice from the counter, calm, casual. but it landed like a dagger. Look at that, justice found its way. Diane's breath hitched. Slowly, she turned. A middle-aged man, impeccably dressed, sat at a table by the window. His fingers idly flipped through a newspaper. He barely glanced at her. Instead, he tapped the front page. Then, with a slow slide, he pushed it across the table toward her. Diane's eyes dropped to the headline. Former flight attendant loses job after abusing high-profile passenger, now working in minimum-wage service industry. The words blurred as nausea rose in her stomach. Her fingers curled around the rag in her hand. Her knuckles turned white. The man didn't sneer. Didn't gloat. He simply picked up his coffee and stirred it absent-mindedly, as if she no longer mattered. And maybe she didn't. Diane swallowed hard, gripping the counter as a wave of nausea washed over her. There was no redemption, no coming back from this. She wasn't feared anymore. She wasn't respected. She was nothing. Just a disgraced ex-flight attendant, wiping tables for people who barely noticed her. She lowered her head, picked up a rag, and kept cleaning. She had nowhere else to go,